Hi everybody, Chris Bryant here with another CCNA 5-minute video boot camp for you. This one on setup mode, how, when, and should you. And we're going to see all of this live on a Cisco router. As a matter of fact, it's going to be this one right here. And as you may know, we have two files as far as the configuration files go on a Cisco router. We've got our startup config file, we have our running config file. Sometimes they have the same content, sometimes they don't. That's for another video. But right now, if we just wanted to look at the startup configuration file, you can just run the command show start. And you can see I've added a couple of lab commands here. I added a couple of IP addresses that we're going to see up here in a moment. So there's definitely a live configuration here on the router. Now, this is not something we get to do very often in production jobs, especially when we want to keep that production job. But what we're going to do here is go ahead and get rid of that startup configuration file, see what happens when we reload the router, and then we're going to talk about setup mode for just a bit. So I'm going to do a command here called write erase. And I'm going to confirm that. I know you're just seeing the firm, but I like to make the font as large as I can. So I ran write erase, which is often just abbreviated as WR space ER, and it even tells you exactly what you're doing. You are erasing the non-volatile RAM file system, which is where the startup file, the startup config file that is kept. So it asked me to confirm. I hit enter. It said, okay, erase of NVRAM complete, and so now that startup file is gone. So if I run show start right now, it's going to tell you that file is not present. So what we want to do is see what happens on a reload when we don't have a startup configuration file. Now this will take a minute or two and it's going to scroll, so I'm going to pause the video and bring you back once we're done. And we're back. So the router is reloaded now. And what happened was, as the router went through its boot processes, it needed to find a startup config file near the end of that entire process. So it starts looking around. The first place it's going to look is in non-volatile RAM. The thing is, though, we erased that with the write erase command, so there was nothing in there to find. And I had the option before I reloaded it to have the router look to a trivial file transfer protocol server, a TFTP server, for that startup config file. I didn't do that. So at this point, the router's just saying, hey, I have no startup config file. Would you like to enter the initial configuration dialog? I hear Hal's voice every time I hear that question. But usually, I would say no to this, because setup file is kind of a clunky way to set up a router. It's a good idea for you to see it at least once, and like right now, for instance, and because I also want to show you how to get out of it if you want to. So let's go ahead and just say yes. And we get a couple of messages here about, question mark for help, default settings are in square brackets, all sounds good to me. Would you like to enter the basic management setup? Well, sure, that's why I'm here. That sounds good. So we'll call our router router1, and the enable secret. Well, that's a password. We know it's used to protect access to privileged exec in config modes, etc. And the enable secret, of course, becomes encrypted in the config, which the router is nice enough to remind us of there on the last line. But let's say that I don't want to set one. So I'll just keep hitting enter, and I can't not set an enable secret password. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to CCNA, and now I have to set an enable password. And it's the same situation. I can't get around that. I have to set one. So I'll put CCNP there. Hey, which one of those takes precedence over the other? Pop quiz. The enable secret always takes precedence over the enable password. So now we're being asked for a VTY password, our virtual terminal password that we would use for Telnet and or SSH. And I can't get around this either. So I'm going to put CCENT for this one. Do I want to configure SNMP? No, etc. And then the interfaces get a little bit clunky here. This is where it gets a little crazed as far as I'm concerned. So it's usually at this point where people say, I really just want to get out of this. I want to go out to the prompt and just configure it myself. So how do we do that? Well, I just did it, and there was a hint earlier. I'm going to wait for this to finish up here. And as you can see, I just saved your eyeballs. A ton of scrolling here when I said that. But what happened is that at this point you'll notice this line, configuration aborted, no changes made. That means that anything you just set, which in this case would have been a couple of passwords, they're gone. You know, no changes have been made to the router, and after a great deal of scrolling and some messages about interfaces, I'm dropped off at the prompt here. And can I even do a show start from there? No, can't do it. So let's try a show start from here. And you can see that we still don't have one. I've got to start writing the config file from scratch and then save it as the startup configuration file. Now the $64 question is, how did I do that? Well, I did it with their little keystroke that they mentioned way up here, and then a lot of people miss because they're in a hurry. I'm guilty too. Use Control-C to abort configuration dialog at any prompt. You can do that at any time. You can go in the interfaces and add all that info that we usually need. You know, you could open some interfaces, put some IP addresses on, whatever you need to do. And then it would continue to prompt you, hey, do you want to configure this? Do you want to configure that? And like I said, at some point you do just say to yourself, hey, I'll just do it from the command line, and I don't want to be prompted about everything a Cisco router can do. So you just do Control-C at that point and you're all set. So that is setup mode, and I appreciate you taking time, 5 minutes that is, to take in my video boot camp today. I'll have a new one for you tomorrow on a couple of lab commands, the logging, synchronous, and exec timeout commands. We need to cover those, and we will do those tomorrow on my YouTube channel. I'll see you there.